Welcome to Eden's Earth. Today, I've been captivated by the primitive reminder of the evolution of the plants on this planet and how they've been guided by the ever captivating sword fern. Because as you see the world around us, roses did not used to send out alluring nectars that made you want to smell them. And Doug firs did not simply turn CO2 into oxygen. In fact, at one point in our history, there was only earth and water. And the earth did not contain nutrients, and the water simply contained bacteria, and the air was not breathable. But over the course of 500 million years, plants evolved to be what they are, what you see today, and the world that you see today. Because if it wasn't for the evolution of plants, mammals would have never been able to live. Because if you look at this sword fern, you kind of notice how it excites your inner primitiveness, and it sings the song of the wet Pacific Northwest forest. Because once upon a time, there was simply a single-celled bacteria known as protozoa. And one day, that protozoa ate another bacteria, and then that formed an organelle. And then that protozoa ate another bacteria, which formed another organelle. And symbiotically, they became green algae. And green algae evolved because of these organelles, because at one time, the protozoa could not do what plants can do now. It simply just lived. But with the evolution, by swallowing these organelles, the green algae was able to turn sunlight into glucose and turn CO2 into oxygen. And so it paved the way for plants as we know it. And so that algae wanted more. It wasn't done evolving. It started grabbing onto other algae, forming connective tissue, binding the cells together, and then eventually moss was formed. And the moss wanted to make its way onto land, so as the tides rushed out, the moss stayed on the land. And because of the evolution that had already taken place, the moss could thrive on land. And then that moss still wanted more, because the moss could hold nitrogen, and it had so many nutrients to go into the soil, but it needed more. And then along came our favorite friend, the fungi. Fungi reached up from the earth into the moss and combined different cells, helping to form vascular tissue. And then that fungi became roots, evolved into roots. And then that moss decomposed into the soil, making the soil full of this rich layer of humus. And as the fungi reached outward into the soil, it made room for the growth of roots. And so with the symbiotic relationship that happened between the protozoa and the bacteria, and then the symbiotic relationship that happened between the fungus and the moss, came forth the future of plants. Because as the moss decomposed away, that humus layer became rich, and there were high amounts of nutrients held in the soil. And then eventually, with the evolution of vascular tissue, came ferns. Because you see, ferns paved the way for microhabitats and the further fertilization of the soil. Because so they have little rhizomatic root systems. And with their rhizomatic root systems, they're able to send out farther and send out reproduce asexually with little runners. But the moss was not able to do things like that because it relied on the water to produce sexually and asexually. Because moss has sperm similar to humans, actually. It's got little flagella on their little sperm that rely on water to swim through the air. And they still do that today. But ferns, since they were able to move away from the water and rely less on the water because of their root system and their vascular tissue, the phloem, the xylem, carrying the phloem carrying the nutrients from the soil, and the xylem carrying the water, and together working like the blood in our own veins, carrying nutrients and water to parts of your body that need it. So with the evolution of that, and the evolution of moss, and the evolution, everything symbiotically working together, ferns develop spores. And these spores were wind dispersal. And so before, moss couldn't really leave the tides, the shores of the water. But ferns develop their little spores. Underneath their fronds, you'll see the little sori that house the sporangium, which hold the spores. And then as the winds began to pick up, they will carry the spores far and wide. And it is because of this very simple action that plants were able to colonize the land. The wind carried the spores as far as they could reach and as far as the water would guide them. And sure enough, colonization happened. And then within the fern itself, insects were able to have a habitat and have food. And then, not only that, but the ferns started to bioremediate their elders and create fertilizer for the soil, which gave rise to the trees, also known as the gymnosperms. And then that gave rise to the angiosperms, also known as flowering plants. So it is this plant that represents almost like the longhouse of the forest, where community is strengthened. And the humbleness of the forest. Everyone can gather, everyone can be together and be whole. So this plant almost has a message for us during this time about the importance of strengthening our community and building our inner souls. Because many mammals rely on this plant. And our soil does too. Because still to this day, we rely on the fertilization of this plant to maintain the rich soils of our forests. And so, as many mammals enjoy this plant, humans don't really eat it that much. Oftentimes you'll see people eating other ferns, but this fern in the Polypoidaceae family is not super edible. And you can see that because along the fronds there's all these different hairs, and these hairs represent the presence of carcinogenic compounds, which could be detrimental to your stomach lining. But there are other ferns in other families that aren't as detrimental and that don't have these hairs, such as the ostrich fern, which we often enjoy the fiddleheads. And you'll notice that they don't have the hairs, and they're super yummy and they taste like asparagus. However, these ones do have the hairs, and although they are very adorable, growing in the middle like a crown on top of the rhizome, they kind of sprawl out, like curling up from the earth, joining its brethren, the youngest in the center and the elders out towards the edge. But as I said, this plant hasn't always been used by humans for food or nutrients, but it's mostly used by the earth. But Native American elders reported during times of famine the root would be eaten and enjoyed. And during times of birth, I learned from Della Rice Sylvester, a Cowichan elder, that the energetic healing from this fern would help women during times of long labors. They would make beds out of the fronds, and the women would lay upon them and bring child into earth. But I think one of the other most important things to know about this plant is that it's actually dying in Seattle parks. And it's dying because it has a disease that's being carried by a lot of the soles of our shoes. And so in Seward Park right now, you see signs that say, don't go off trail, please stay on trail. And yet people still go off trail from one side where the ferns have died, carrying the disease, to the other side where the ferns are healthy. And then they take their shoes and then they go up into the forest. So in the city, where our ferns can be restored and remediated and we can take care of them, where healthcare is more accessible in the city. Out in the forest, this disease is being carried by the soles of our shoes into these forests that have become detrimental to the health and the ecosystem. That kind of sounds like something else going on, doesn't it? Almost like a message that the fern wants to remind us that we need to stick together and be with each other in times of darkness, and building stronger community and building stronger sense of communication, and just realizing that in the city we have so much access to health, but in rural areas people have the bare minimum. So I want you to take the message of this sword fern, that symbiotic relationships are so important to our society. Building community and building, strengthening, fostering community is the only way to promote a healthy evolution of our society. Thank you and green blessings.